My name is Jade. I'm a registered nurse, a public health grad student, and a safety consultant for the entertainment industry. And welcome back to my YouTube channel. I have not been active on here in a while. I've been in Canada, in Alberta, working on a feature film. It wrapped at the end of June. Today I am back with a story for you all. Today I'm talking about the Love Canal Disaster. And as I've talked about before on this channel, disasters of any kind, man-made or natural, fall under the umbrella of public health, and they're also just super interesting. And so I wanted to share it with y'all. It's like 9:30 p.m. and 140 billion degrees outside, so I figured it's like a good time as any to have some coffee. In October of 1974, Karen Schroeder looked out the back window of the ranch-style home where she lived with her husband Timothy at 460 99th Street in Niagara Falls, New York. Karen glanced out into their yard on that autumn morning to the fiberglass pool that she and Tim had saved up their money to build into the ground of their backyard, along with a redwood fence enclosing it. What Karen saw when she gave a passing glance out the back window caused her distress, but there is no way that she could have possibly known that the scene in her backyard would manifest a crisis that would not only impact her home, but over 1,000 homes in her Niagara Falls neighborhood. Karen saw that their pool had suddenly risen 2 feet out of the ground. Karen immediately called her husband Timothy to tell him about the situation. Tim and Karen believed that the rising of their pool was because of unusual groundwater flow to the area in which they lived. The Schroeders didn't assume anything necessarily insidious was afoot other than it's really inconvenient, and they waited until the following summer to pull it out from the ground, intending to pour a new concrete pool in its place. So this wasn't like the kind of pool that sits on top of the ground and you dive in and then it falls apart and it makes a really funny video for the internet. No, this was the bougie kind that you build into the ground. They had worked really hard to save up the money to do this. What happened next was even more alarming than the pool rising in the first place. After they had taken that pool out of the ground, the hole that the pool was sitting in immediately filled up with liquids that were all different colors: blue, purple, black, yellow. It looked like chemicals. The chemicals wasted no time mixing with the groundwater and flooded the Schroeders' entire yard, consuming posts of that nice redwood fence that they built around it with a caustic singe that would eventually collapse the fence altogether. The scene in the Schroeders' yard was just the beginning of uncovering what the media would call a public health time bomb. So for those of you who maybe aren't in the United States, it's kind of safe to say that Niagara Falls is considered to be one of the most alluring natural formations in North America. So Niagara Falls is not only a formation of waterfalls, but it's also a town, and it's located about 17 miles northwest of Buffalo, New York, and about 75 miles southeast of the Canadian city of Toronto, Ontario. The falls consist of 3 separate waterfalls at the southern end of the Niagara Gorge, which lines the border between Ontario, Canada, and New York State in the United States. The largest of the 3 falls is called Horseshoe Falls, shaped like a horseshoe. Niagara Falls has long been a picturesque tourist destination. The combined falls have the highest flow rate of any waterfall in North America, and it has a vertical drop of 160 feet or 50 meters. During peak daytime tourist hours, there is 6 million cubic feet of water going over the falls every minute. With the high flow rate and steep drop, it makes sense that Niagara Falls is a massively important source of hydroelectric power. However, most of us know Niagara Falls as a beautiful destination for sightseeing, as well as lots of weddings and honeymoons alike. In order to understand how such a beautiful tourist destination can lead to the scene that we just heard about at the home of Karen and Timothy Schroeder, we have to go all the way back to the year 1890 to an idea put into action by a one William T. Love. Love was a railroad entrepreneur in 1890 and wanted to make a planned urban community of parks and homes along Lake Ontario. Sounds lovely, right? But as with any mustachioed man of the 1800s who looks like this would do, Love's mind was on industry. He definitely looks like it too. I looked him up just so I could be like, I wonder if he looks like I would think. He definitely does. It did not disappoint. So at this time, electricity was transmitted through direct current. This form of electricity didn't allow the current to be transported very far before it began to fade in strength. So for this reason, it greatly benefited those with high power needs like factories and plants to be as near as possible to the water to harness that electricity as close to the source as possible. So you have the least amount of loss of power possible, right? So William T. Love dreamed of attracting factories and plants of burgeoning industries to his planned community, and he would name this project Model City, New York. That kind of reminded me of, in the movie Almost Famous, when at the end of the movie, like Penny Lane, she hasn't told anyone her name this entire time, and finally she's like, my mother said, marry up, marry someone grand. That's why she named me Lady. And then whatever Patrick Fugit is like, she named you Lady? And she's like, Lady Goodman. That's kind of what that reminded me of. I don't know. It's a great movie. Okay. So in 1892, Love got financing to incorporate a shipping canal that would bypass Niagara Falls. This would be called, poetically, Love Canal. The money for this venture came from banks in New York City, Chicago, and England. And at this point, steel companies and other manufacturers were showing a lot of interest in opening plants along Love Canal. However, in 1893, the first tragedy of this series of very unfortunate events struck. There was a large-scale economic panic, and unfortunately, a lot of investors ended their sponsorship of Love's Model City. And then in 1906, environmental groups, yes, those existed back then because climate change is not like a brand new thing, environmental groups lobbied Congress to pass legislation that would preserve Niagara Falls. Yay! You tried. Thanks. So this legislation prohibited removing water from Niagara River and thus made Love's Canal project dead in the water. I'm so sorry for how heavy-handed that phrasing ended up being. I really wrote that. I really did write that. Okay. But 1907 had even more unforeseen obstacles for what was left of Love's Model City. It was like hanging on barely by a thread. There was yet another economic panic, and a bright young inventor developed a cheaper, much more efficient form of electric current. Nikola Tesla has entered the chat. Nikola Tesla's invention of alternating current electricity allowed power to be transported over great distances without losing much energy at all. Bad news for Love, but again, thanks from the future, Nikola Tesla. I'm going to go on record saying I will experience no shame envisioning Nikola Tesla as David Bowie playing Nikola Tesla for the rest of time, okay? So you're just all going to have to enjoy that with me because this is my channel. So the combination of another economic panic and the reasoning for Love's Canal being rendered pretty much moot by this point, all remaining investors in the Model City forced Love to abandon the project altogether. Pack it in, pal. Throw in the towel. Wave the white flag. Just give up. So Love abandoned the project and they left the partially dug canal, which was 40 feet deep and 50 feet wide, as it was. They just didn't fill it in or anything. Just left a pit. And as we all know, companies leaving pits in the ground after abandoning commercial projects always goes well. So after the project was abandoned, obviously the canal filled up with water. Children swam in there in the summers, skated on it in the winters, and after about a decade, the city began using the canal as a municipal landfill, meaning people could just put their trash there. Even though Love's Canal was not an artery of industrial plants as he envisioned, there was an increase in demand for industrial products as the United States became more successful economically. So products like paper, rubber, plastics, petrochemicals, carbon insulators, whatever the that is. So those were all produced en masse via factories and plants around Niagara Falls. The increase in industry and technical advancements allowed Niagara Falls, the town, not the actual falls, to see great economic prosperity and population growth. So because of the increase in industry, there was a need to begin dumping industrial waste, so more like chemicals and stuff like that. Hooker Chemical Company, I'm going to pause so you can laugh at that right now because I'm going to say the word hooker a lot of times in this video. Hooker Chemical Company was one of these companies that was looking for a place for disposal of chemicals. In 1942, the Niagara Power and Development Company granted Hooker permission to dump waste into the canal, and Hooker Chemical Company became the sole user and owner of that site. 10 years go by when Hooker Chemical is just dumping barrel after barrel of toxic waste into this canal. At the time, yes, they knew that these chemicals were harmful, but there was no real regulation in place for how to dispose of these things. And so they were technically following the rules of the day. So that's important to keep in mind because it comes up later. But in 1952, Hooker decided to stop using the canal as their dump site because it had become apparent that the land surrounding the area would be developed for human use. By this time, there was an estimated over 20,000 tons of chemicals in the canal. I'm going to be specific about what chemicals were in the dump site for people who want to tell me, but Jade, everything is chemicals. I know. But the chemicals in the canal were mostly caustics, alkalines, fatty acids, and chlorinated hydrocarbons. In other words, poisons. So Hooker Chemical sees the land surveyors and developers looking at the land around them as they're dumping chemicals into this canal, just drum after drum of toxic waste. And they're seeing people kind of eyeing it like, maybe we should build some housing or schools on that. And Hooker Chemical is like, what? Here? You want to build right here? Okay. Just a second. Okay, I guess we gotta clean this up somehow? No? What do we do then? We just leave it. I mean, that seems good. I don't really feel like moving it, so in March 1952, the superintendent of Niagara Falls School Board inquired about purchasing the Love Canal property from Hooker Chemical for the purpose of building a new school. That's right, a school. For children. Awesome. And Hooker Chemical was like, you want to build a what? But then they had an idea. The next month, in April of 1952, Hooker's vice president, Bjarne Clausen, discussed the sale of the land with Ashley Wilcox, who was Hooker's in-house legal counsel, as well as the company's president, R.L. Murray, suggesting that the sale could absolve them of liability for future issues resulting from the buried chemicals. He said, quote, "The more we thought about it, the more interested Wilcox and I became in the proposition, and finally came to the conclusion that the Love Canal property is rapidly becoming a liability because of housing projects in the near vicinity of our property. A school, however, could be built in the center, unfilled section with the chemicals underground. We became convinced that it would be a wise move to turn this property over to the schools, provided we could not be held responsible for future claims or damages resulting from underground storage of chemicals," unquote. Good plan, guys. So Hooker agreed to sell its property to the school board for $1 with a liability limitation. So keep in mind what we just heard. So the quote before was internal, that was Hooker Chemical talking amongst themselves about it. And now this quote is from Hooker Chemical to the school board about the purchase. Quote, "Our offices have carefully considered your request. We are very conscious of the need for new elementary schools and realize that the sites must be carefully selected so that they will best serve the area involved. We feel that the Board of Education has done a fine job in meeting the expanding demand for additional facilities, and we are anxious to cooperate in any proper way. We have, therefore, come to the conclusion that since this location is the most desirable one for this purpose, we will be willing to donate the entire strip of property which we own between Colvin Boulevard and Frontier Avenue to be used for the erection of a school at a location to be determined." So they reached an accord, and in April of 1953, the sale document was signed and included the caveat, which at the time released the company from all obligations should lawsuits occur in the future. You thought. Basically, Hooker Chemical placed all responsibility for the chemicals in the school's hands, and they were wildly unqualified to be stewards of carcinogenic chemicals. This was an attempt to avoid responsibility. Clearly, this is a choice that experts say, quote, would ultimately come back to haunt not only Hooker Chemical, but all other chemical producers in the United States through the strict liability provisions of Superfund legislation. And that's a quote from Craig E. Colton and Peter N. Skinner. Hindsight's 2020, right? After taking control of the land, the Niagara Falls School Board developed the land for the 99th Street School. In January of 1954, the school's architect, architect wrote to the education committee to tell them that during excavation, workers had discovered 2 dump sites filled with 55-gallon drums containing chemical wastes. The architect stated that it would be, quote, poor policy to build in that area since it was not known what wastes were in the ground, and the concrete foundation may be compromised. Heeding this advice somewhat, the school board relocated the school site to 85 feet north. Okay, 85 feet. After the school was completed, 400 children attended in 1955. So basically what happened was that the land was sold to the school board for a very specific purpose, and it was recommended that the school board not sell the land for private development later on, because then kind of the chain of custody of those chemicals would be really compromised, and people would have no idea what was there, and it would put a whole lot of people's lives in danger. And Hooker Chemical knew this and basically did exactly enough to cover their asses, or so they thought. Basically, it shouldn't be the school's job to make sure that those chemicals are responsibly looked after for the rest of time. So then the school board sold it to private contractors to build homes and another school on the land as well. While building the gravel sewer beds under the aforementioned construction, they were building these for planned housing units, basically low-income housing in the area. While they were doing that, they punctured the walls of the clay seal of the canal that had been put in place to keep the chemicals inside. And then rainwater took over and carried the chemicals, which had been lying in wait under the ground, out of the safety of the canal and into the soil surrounding it. This made large puddles, which children saw and they looked really fun, and so they played in them because they're children and they have no idea what it is, so because they were never told. The school board's attorney, Ralph Boniello, said he did not receive any communication relating the exact nature of the waste and what its potential for harm might be. They did not know what was there and exactly the damage it could cause or the lives that it could ruin. 800 private homes and 240 low-income apartments were constructed on the site. None of the residents of any of these housing developments or private homes were ever made aware of the canal's history. So aside from the many obvious issues with this, here's why this was so problematic. Divesting the land into parcels to be developed by many different private companies, none of which had any legal obligation to communicate with each other or the previous owners of the land, pretty much all hope of the already cloaked information about the nature of the chemicals underground had been lost. Children were literally playing in toxic, cancerous industrial chemical waste. It's reported that when they played on their school's playgrounds, their eyes teared. 3 children were burned by exposed chemicals on the surface of the canal. An extremely wet winter in 1962 caused the expressway to elevate and become an overflowing pool. And then in 1977, another harsh and wet winter caused the water table to rise again. What is a water table? Basically, when someone is talking about the water table, it means how saturated the ground is and how prone the area will be to flooding. So if the water table is high, the ground is already pretty saturated, and so the water doesn't really have anywhere to go, so it's going to flood. I want to take us back to Karen Schroeder, with whom we started our story. Remember the one who had discovered her pool being shoved out of the ground in 1974? Now we're going backwards from there 6 years to November 21st, 1968 at 11:12 p.m. Karen Schroeder was in the hospital giving birth to her 3rd child, a girl named Sherry. However, there was silence in the delivery room as her little girl entered the world. Sherry was 7 pounds, which is a healthy weight for a newborn, but her birth defects were apparent right on delivery in that room. Her heartbeat was irregular because of a hole in her heart muscle, bone blockages in her nose. She was partially deaf with deformed exterior ears and a cleft palate. When Sherry was 2 years old, the Schroeders were told that she was also mentally disabled. When Sherry's teeth began coming in, there were 2 rows of teeth on her lower jaw, and she gradually developed an enlarged liver. They believed that the effects in their daughter was genetic or pure chance, but they loved their little girl as any good parents would. By 1977, the residents had been complaining of odors and persistent black fluids in their yards, playgrounds, and basements. By 1978, the Schroeders couldn't even walk in their backyard because of how badly the toxic sludge had broken up their land. They couldn't move because there was no way that anyone would purchase their home with toxic sludge oozing out of the ground. Their yard had previously been featured in a local newspaper for its beautiful landscaping, and now it was a toxic pit that was making them and their 4 children sicker every single day. The events at Love Canal made activists out of many community members and led to legislation and environmental regulations that are still in effect today. The activism at Love Canal was primarily organized by a woman named Lois Gibbs, who served as the spokeswoman in demanding assistance for her family and all of the families affected by this tragedy. Before the government ever looked into the potential poisoning at Love Canal, Gibbs noticed that there was a high rate of illnesses and miscarriages, and that the vegetation in the area was unhealthy or simply non-existent. She noticed this coinciding with complaints from residents about strange odors and substances surfacing in the basements and yards. A woman named Luella Kenny experienced the tragic death of her son, John Allen, at the age of 7 due to kidney failure. He was the only one of her 3 children who had been born at Love Canal. Later, health officials came to investigate at Kenny's house, and while they were there, a bird flew into the creek, sipped some water, and immediately dropped dead. Can you imagine seeing these things in the community where you live? Can you imagine realizing that not only had you been living in a place that seemed to be extremely toxic to everything it touched, but that you had also been raising your children in a place like this? I honestly can't imagine the fear that that would cause. These are stories that Lois Gibbs gathered when talking to her community members on door-to-door visits, and slowly a bigger picture began to develop of exactly what was going on at Love Canal. Gibbs discovered that there had been chemicals buried under the canal, and this began her 2-year effort to demonstrate that the chemical waste was connected to the health problems of the residents. Another character in this story is Stephen Lester. He was a Harvard scientist and had been appointed by the New York State Health Department to advise the residents of Love Canal. Here's a quote from him. "When I met the State Health Department, I was told Lois was very emotional and she lies to the public and makes things up. These 2 sides clearly don't like each other, so I decided I wouldn't take sides." After a month on the assignment, Lester said he quickly realized that Lois was telling more of the truth than the state people were. However, Hooker Chemical, which was now under the name of Occidental Petroleum, ignored the concerns, as did the Niagara Falls government. The then mayor of Niagara Falls, Michael O'Loughlin, stated infamously that there was, quote, "nothing wrong" at Love Canal. Something I think is interesting that's widely shared about Lois is that she was very shy and quiet prior to becoming a spokesperson for this cause. She had simply been going door to door, gathering stories from her neighbors, talking to them about organizing to advocate for their community, and gathering signatures on a petition to close the 99th Street School. But she never intended to become the public-facing spokeswoman for this cause. Gibbs reports thinking, quote, "Where's the leader? I'm a housewife of 6 kids. My job is not to become a community leader." On August 2nd, 1978, that would change. Gibbs had finally gathered hundreds of signatures on her petition, and she drove with a neighbor to Albany, the capital of New York. It's reported that as they arrived at the Capitol, there were reporters gathered and taking their pictures, asking if she was Lois Gibbs. August 2nd is the day that there was a state of emergency declared at Love Canal by President Jimmy Carter. This was serendipitously happening right as they arrived, and the announcement was made that the 99th Street School would be closed. The commissioner of the New York State Health Department was recommending relocation of pregnant women and parents of young children in the area. It was announced that it would help residents find temporary housing and that they could return after the cleanup, but the government wouldn't be paying for it. So Lois and her neighbor drove back to Niagara Falls from Albany that night, and when they arrived, their neighbors were burning their mortgages in a barrel and called for Lois to make a speech. And Lois took the stage and made her very first public speaking appearance to do just that. Lois was appointed the head of the Homeowners Association and decided to make it the most democratic organization possible to focus efforts on serving everyone. It was determined that there were in excess of 200 compounds present. Just to name a few here: benzene, toluene, dioxin, processed sludge, chloroform, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, and the residential municipal garbage that was already underneath. By the time these chemicals were discovered in Love Canal, many of them were already known carcinogens, and they were known to attack the heart and liver and cause birth defects. If you don't know what a carcinogen is, it's basically anything that is known to cause cancer. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services states that long-term exposure to high levels of benzene in the air can cause leukemia and cancer of the blood-forming organs. That's like bone marrow, spleen, liver. Dioxins are environmental pollutants that are one of a dozen dangerous chemicals that are known as persistent organic pollutants, or POPs or POPs. Dioxins are extremely toxic even in very small quantities, because of their ability to be absorbed in the fatty tissue in your body, which allows them to be stored for a very long time inside your fat cells. High levels of dioxins can cause skin lesions, darkening of the skin, altered liver function. Long-term exposure can cause the immune system to become severely compromised. So this harm is done when your cells replicate. For this reason, the demographic most sensitive to dioxin toxicity are developing fetuses. So this makes sense if you think about it, because their cells are replicating and being produced very, very quickly. That leaves more opportunity for a great amount of harm to be done in a very short span of time, and also means that the damage can be permanent or lifelong. In 1980, a report was released by the EPA, and it sparked outrage. The report announced findings on the existed and predicting long-term effects of the poisoning at Love Canal. That report revealed a disturbingly high rate of miscarriages and stated that Love Canal can now be added to a growing list of environmental disasters involving toxics. In short, the nightmare of the Love Canal poisoning wasn't over, and that the health effects had slithered their way into the genetics of the exposed people. The effects were in their very DNA and could be passed on for generations. Unfortunately for Timothy and Karen Schroeder and many of their neighbors, the damage had already been done. In a report by Eckert C. Beck, the EPA administrator for Region 2 from 1977 to 1979, he recounts Timothy saying, quote, "I heard someone from the press saying that there were only 5 cases of birth defects here. When you go back to the EPA, please don't use the phrase only 5 cases. People must realize that this is a tiny community. 5 birth defect cases here is terrifying." Even after this information became available, even though Jimmy Carter himself called this one of the grimmest discoveries of the modern era, the federal government refused the plea from the Love Canal victims to pay to move everyone out of the area. Keep in mind that many people felt completely stuck in their toxic homes at this point because there was no way anyone would buy any of these homes when this was going on. This was like throwing gasoline on a fire at that time. Literally. Lois reported that her neighbors were pouring gasoline on their lawns, spelling out EPA and lighting them on fire. While this was happening, there were 2 EPA's officials staying nearby at a hotel. Lois invited them to come to an abandoned home to meet with community members to talk about the results of the study that they released. Once the officials arrived, the residents blockaded them inside. The EPA spokesman and scientists were effectively taken hostage. They wanted the nation's eye on Love Canal so that pressure would be put on the Carter administration, who at the time was in the middle of a brutal re-election campaign. The FBI quickly came to town, shut off access to the phones, and negotiations were made. The residents agreed to let the EPA members go, given that President Carter would act by noon on Wednesday, giving them 4 days to meet their demands of helping residents with relocation. And he did just that. And we'll get back to Lois, but I need to talk about another side to this issue that is less talked about in media coverage at the time and since. When I was taking my environmental and occupational health class where I first learned about this incident, my section leader was Dr. Natasha Desjarnette. She said something in one of our classes that stuck with me. She said it was something one of her former mentors told her, that when you're talking about environmental issues, if you're on the side of intersectionality, you will always be right. This means that advocating for the most marginalized group affected by an issue and recognizing that the extent to which environmental issues impact a group of people is usually heavily dependent on things like socioeconomic factors, race, ethnicity, and since the 1950s to the 1980s weren't the most harmonious years for people of color. No, none of it has been, honestly. We've been racist the whole time. We absolutely need to talk about how this event impacted non-white, non-homeowners that were also victims of Love Canal. I hope that you might have already noticed a couple things that raised some red flags in your mind about equality. Number one, homeowners. The movement was driven and focused around giving homeowners a voice. What about those who were renting? What about those low-income and planned housing developments that were made and primarily occupied by immigrants and families of color? And number two, if you were listening to the story of that hostage situation and thinking that no one was hurt, no one was even arrested, and they were holding 2 federal government officials hostage, that's just bananas to me. I'm not condemning that action because you must do what you have to get someone to listen when injustice is unfolding before you. But how many times have Black and brown people taken similar and even much less drastic actions and been met with much heavier consequences? While this was all unfolding, the NAACP became involved. The president of the Niagara Falls chapter was William Abrams Sr., whose wife passed of liver failure due to the poisoning at Love Canal. He brought attention to the potential of people of color to become left behind in relocation efforts because of the focus on the Homeowners Association and the additional obstacles that people of color faced and still face in having equal access to housing. Abrams brought this concern to the regional director of the NAACP, who then announced that discrimination against minorities in the relocation at Love Canal would be met with legal action. This is good because this situation was ripe with opportunity to discriminate. Racism is a systemic issue and doesn't only involve person-to-person aggression, but I'm not going to dive into explaining all of that. This is already a crazy long video, but I'll link some information if you're unfamiliar with the concept of systemic racism in the description because it is really important. So this announcement from the NAACP garnered support from the renting community, which was primarily comprised of Black and immigrant communities from Love Canal. This led to the organization of the Concerned Love Canal Renters Association. This group sought to make sure that the needs of the renting community were considered in all aspects of relocation. It seems to me that Lois treated the Renters Association as allies, uniting for a common cause to have everyone relocated without expense to any of the families. However, it was the state who tried to divide the Homeowners Association and pit them against the Renters Association and vice versa. From the sound of it, the state officials were telling each group untruths about the other, trying to separate them because it would make each group weaker respectively and take some of the heat off of the state. Basically, the state was trying to divide and conquer and avoid accountability at all costs. Lois said that her and Sarah, the leader of the Griffin Manor residents, met and decided that they would work together but with parallel groups. They would go on to meet often and coordinate with the two groups' activity but would not let the state or even their own members know that this was happening for fear that they would continue to interfere with their collaborations and solidarity. Sarah and Lois, together representing the Homeowners Association and the Renters Association, eventually told the state that they demanded a seat at the table for the Griffin Manor families and recognition of the concerned renters as an individual entity. And the state agreed. Hell yes. I'm not about to praise a white lady for including people of color in her crusade for justice because that is the way it should always be. But that has often not been the case with many of history's most notable heroines. I honestly didn't expect it to end that way. The renters of Love Canal were getting organized and uniting in their effort to advocate for equal designation of relocation funds from the government. Now listen, when you're fighting people in authority positions on issues of injustice, do not let them turn you against each other. Hold the line, stay united, hold them accountable. So the relocation happened. Houses on both sides of the canal were demolished, and on June 4th, 1980, the state government founded the Love Canal Area Revitalization Agency. The northern area of Love Canal became known as Black Creek Village. The most toxic area was reburied with thick plastic liner, clay, and dirt, and 8 feet of a barbed wire fence was erected to keep people out. You might wonder, why didn't they put the waste somewhere else? It was basically determined by experts that it would be more risky to move the waste elsewhere than to just basically contain it as best that they could. When all was said and done, 950 families were evacuated. But this is not where the story ends. It was basically a massive realization that there were going to be sites like this all over the country. There were going to be toxic dump sites that were previously unregulated that were just ticking time bombs, essentially. This is why some serious legislation was passed following the Love Canal tragedy to address other toxic dump sites that could be all over the U.S. On December 1st, 1995, Occidental Petroleum was ordered to pay $129 million in the Love Canal settlement. The lawsuit was filed by the U.S. Justice Department and took 16 years to litigate. At this time, Janet Reno was the U.S. Attorney General. Does anyone else feel like Janet Reno's name always comes up in the most wild cases that people still love to talk about? Anyway, Janet Reno said the settlement, quote, should send a message of federal persistence and tenacity. The EPA administrator at the time stated strong environmental laws are vital to protecting the health of the 1 in 4 Americans who still live near toxic waste dumps. By the way, I found 2 typos in this brief from the federal government. 2 typos. 2. Where's my fries? So again, thanks from the future for all that. But when it's juxtaposed with the story about the massive battle it took to get the government to fix this, it's okay, you did your job, thank you, but sit down. Occidental Petroleum had been deemed negligent but not reckless in their sale of the land to the Niagara Falls School Board because, hey, they didn't break any laws at the time. But the current law says that does not matter. The entire cleanup process took about 21 years and costed $400 million. Love Canal became the first entry on the list of the Superfund Act. This was also known as the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CRCLA. Not as catchy or badass as Superfund Act. CRCLA created something called the National Priorities List, or the NPL. Love Canal was the first entry on the list and was removed on September 30th, 2004. CRCLA basically says that whoever created the waste is responsible for cleaning it up, and it does not matter if you were following all of the laws at the time. Superfund is a trust fund set up by Congress to handle emergency and hazardous waste sites that need long-term cleaning. Today, most Superfund sites are getting cleaned up, but the effort is always ongoing. CRCLA also has a joint and several provision. This means that if there is even one contributor to the waste dump still alive, that party is responsible for cleaning it up. Otherwise, the Superfund, aka our tax dollars, is used to clean up the site. And there are about 1,300 Superfund sites on the national priorities list. Some sites may take decades to clean up, and as the sites get cleaner, it becomes more expensive and tedious to clean. So now the main priority of everything is to prevent the contamination in the first place, because this is always going to be the cheapest option. Just to horrify my viewers in the United States, I'm going to put a map on the screen of all the Superfund sites in the United States. If you want to find out exactly where Superfund sites near you are, I'll put a link in the description where you can go look at the sites, their locations, and the nature of the contaminants that are found there. It's kind of fun to scoot around the map and see where stuff is. New Jersey has the highest concentration of sites, which probably comes as a surprise to exactly no one. Taxpayers in the US pay a collective about $250 million to clean up Superfund sites every year. In case you're wondering what Occidental Petroleum is up to today, their stock sits around $27, and their website declares themselves, quote, a sustainable energy leader, stating, we are a best-in-class, low-cost operator with assets in the United States, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Pretty much every oil company is now framing themselves as leaders in the fight against climate change because, what are their other options? They knew about and hid research showing how detrimental their practices were for decades. They're not just going to be like, you got me. It's really hard to say how many lives were impacted by the Love Canal tragedy and other man-made environmental crises because the effects can last for years and even generations. Love Canal and other incidences, such as the lesser-known Valley of the Drums, were simply the first of the ticking time bombs to go off. Luckily, the legislation that passed as a result of the events at Love Canal helped save others from experiencing a similar fate from toxic wastes that were buried near their homes. If you want to go down a really fun Wikipedia rabbit hole, I'm going to leave you with this page. Long-term nuclear waste warning messages. These are proposed ways of warning humans in the distant future that nuclear waste is deposited in an area and thus to leave it alone. These are incredible, but my favorite is the forbidding blocks method. This method involves, quote, a network of hundreds of house-sized stone blocks dyed black and arranged in an irregular square grid, suggesting a network of streets which feel ominous and lead nowhere. The blocks are intended to make a large area entirely unsuitable for farming or other future use. Goth? Dystopian? Ominous? Sign me up. Because if we've learned anything here, it's that we, as humans, have a very short collective memory and need help. And when it comes to something as important as where we buried toxic and nuclear waste, dear God, help us. Sorry from the past. So before, they were just putting municipal waste in the landfill, in the space where the canal was supposed. I just scared the shit out of myself. Oh my God. I live on the second floor and I just saw my reflection of my hand moving in the window and literally just almost had a heart attack. Holy shit. Calm down, old gal.